I'm delighted to be here. It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Friday. I wish I had a taser. I would not use it on you, merely me. But I do appreciate your fortitude, and I do appreciate your attention. I do not have PowerPoint slides, and as I always say at these events, that is not because I cannot do PowerPoint. It is because I choose not to do PowerPoint. A few provisos. Everything I say is my own opinion. Does not necessarily reflect anyone at the Baker Institute. I have a paper on U.S.-China energy cooperation back there. It's not my paper. It's a piece that I worked with two very fine collaborators, James Cohn and Jarir Alas. I urge you to read it. A few more provisos. I'm not an economist, although I've been accused of practicing economics without a license. Nor am I a fortune teller. That's always something very important to mention at energy conferences. If I were to define the relationship between China and the United States, simply, I would say that it's essentially one of strategic ambiguity. The United States and China are neither friends nor enemies. We're both partners and competitors. And I believe that this strategic ambiguity should come as no surprise, given the important historical trends underway. The United States is a superpower in almost certain, if slow, decline. Let me stress that the decline of the United States will be A, very slow, and B, a relative decline. The people of the United States in the year 2050 will almost certainly live longer, be richer, and with a little bit of luck, be even more secure than the Americans of today. But I do not believe that in the year 2050, the United States will command the same international position that it does today. I would be truly astonished, A, were I to be alive in 2050, but if I were alive in 2050, I would be truly astonished were the United States to retain 20 to 25% of world GDP, as it does today. And I would even be more astonished in the year 2050 if the United States represented roughly 50% of world defense expenditures. So my general theory is that the United States is undergoing a slow relative decline. China, on the other hand, is an emerging power finding its way in an international order that remains centered on the United States. This is an interesting strategic mix. Past history has a very mixed record on the way international orders accommodate new powers. International order had great difficulties accommodating Japan and Germany in the last century. Less difficulty, by the way, accommodating the United States, although this has a lot to do with the fortunes of war and conflict, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about here. Now look, when I talk about the United States relative decline, and I don't want to overdraw the case. As we've heard today, China remains a profoundly poor country compared to the United States. It is unlikely to sustain growth rates of 10% ad infinitum. I believe that there is a political economic problem associated with the regime, whether you call it the authoritarian bargain or whatever you'd like. I can safely tell you what I think the United States government will be like in the year 2050. Pretty much what it's like today, and pretty much what it was like 50 years ago. I do not, however, believe I can say the same thing with any certainty about China. We also need not alarm ourselves just yet about the Chinese military buildup, although we should watch it carefully. Chinese military, particularly in terms of its ability to project power, comes nowhere close to that of the United States. We have, I believe, 11 carrier groups. The Chinese 10. The Chinese have just floated a 1980s technology, Soviet come Ukrainian aircraft carrier. The Chinese, for better or for worse, and you wonder sometimes if we've not also been cursed by our capabilities, the Chinese, for instance, are entirely incapable of the operations that we launched over the course of the last decade in Iraq and Afghanistan. Nonetheless, there's a historic shift underway, rather like the one I think that occurred starting basically during World War II, where we saw a huge amount of power shift from London and Paris to Washington and Moscow. Conflict is neither inevitable, but neither is cooperation. We will be talking a little bit about cooperation in the energy field. We've talked a lot about it today in general terms. There have been areas of cooperation between the United States and China in recent years in all sorts of areas. Although it's been unsuccessful to date, I think the six-party talks about North Korea have been sort of a heartwarming example of cooperation. There remain, however, areas of difference. I don't need to go through them. Taiwan, human rights. Also, China's association with what the United States refers to as rogue states, especially Iran and Sudan. And of course, there are also areas of differences about trade, which does not stop us from being significant trading partners. My guess is that in future years and decades, you'll see both countries pursuing hedging strategies, uncertain of how the other will behave in the years to come. I think China and the United States will pursue policies that allow them flexibility, that allow them to commitments that aren't too ironclad. They'll also, both the United States and China, will be looking for allies, and this is particularly true in East Asia. It was after I'd written my paper on hedging strategies, paper's not about hedging, but mentions hedging strategies, that the word came out about the little Marine base in Australia. 10 days ago we announced that, which is to me just a very classic example of how both the American policy and the sharp and negative Chinese reaction are to me a template of what we can expect in the years ahead. I think that if we can expect to see a lot of hedging strategies on both sides, in general can expect to see hedging strategies from both sides in the energy arena. It's particularly true for China. So, on the one hand, I think China will be interested in stability in the Persian Gulf. On the other hand, they're also going to be interested in pipelines from Central Asia. China faces a huge strategic dilemma in the energy arena, which is that its economic growth, to a large extent, depends upon the import of oil, and yet the United States, through its command of the sea, can interdict those oil imports at any time it chooses. China, although it could disrupt the ship movements and tanker movements close to its borders, is decades, not years, away from controlling the sea lanes from the Persian Gulf. So China's likely to continue cooperation with the United States where it can. It will probably continue to seek partners in places where the United States chooses not to go. I've never been one of those who's particularly concerned about Chinese involvement in Sudan or Iran. Maybe that's because I actually lived in Sudan for a while. To me, the concern about Chinese involvement in places like Iran and Sudan was always exaggerated, because to me, the fact that China was constrained to be involved in countries like that was a sign of weakness, strategic weakness, not of strategic strength. If you have your druthers, you don't deal with Tehran and Khartoum, right, in this world. And yet I think there are areas for cooperation. Perhaps, as Amy's mentioned before, perhaps through oil-consuming countries, certainly closer cooperation on stockpiling, strategic reserve releases, in time, more what I would call more granular market interventions, perhaps. And we'll hear this a lot, maybe some common action on stability in the Middle East, but be very careful about this because we're Americans and we just seem to assume that everybody in the world has to agree with us. And the truth of the matter is that countries like the United States and China have different conception of what constitutes stability in a place like the Middle East. I do not think that China thought the invasion of Iraq contributed to stability in the Middle East. In this, at least, China was correct. My main point is this. It's one thing to say that China and the United States may share an interest in stability in the Middle East. It's another thing altogether to say that this inevitably means that China will support any U.S. policy toward Iran. China will not support any U.S. policy toward Iran. Couple points in conclusion. U.S.-China cooperation energy is important, but it's only a subset of broader U.S.-Chinese relations. If U.S.-Chinese relations go sour and go south, for whatever reason, cooperation in the energy sector will suffer. All right? Looking forward, as I mentioned, I think you'll see both countries undertaking hedging strategies. I think it's going to be very difficult to manage the U.S.-Chinese relationship over the next 25 years. Let us be quite blunt here. The United States, since the end of the Cold War, has gotten used to being the only superpower in the world. We have, from the very beginnings of our existence, felt that we possess a God-given or fate-given or destiny-driven role to play as a city on the hill, as a light unto the peoples. To this day, any time a candidate or a politician in the United States deviates ever so slightly from the belief that the United States is the greatest and will always be the greatest country in the world, this politician can expect immediate response. China is not going to accept American exceptionalism as the abiding ideology of the future world system, right? So it's going to be very, very difficult to manage relations in a way that avoid conflict. I think we may be able to do so, and I hope we will. And I will say this in conclusion, that there is no better way to make an enemy than go looking for one. I think on both sides, in the years and decades ahead, the premium will have to be on forbearance, because this is going to be very, very difficult stuff, not just for our elites, but for our populations, particularly the U.S. population, as we learn to accommodate ourselves to a very different world, and a very different world where China has a ever more important part to play. Thank you.
I think I'll just stay in my seat here. Thanks, Amy, for inviting me once again. I'm James Russell from the Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey, California. I teach in the Department of National Security Affairs. I'm teaching the Middle Eastern Studies curriculum, and I'm educating military officers from around the world in U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East and all kinds of other sorts of things. I'm a good government worker, civil servant, but I'm here representing my own opinions, so don't call up the postgraduate school and complain about me mouthing off here. The head of the school would simply just look at you or call you back and say, I've got a whole campus full of these types of people. So don't do that. So I'm here to talk about U.S.-China relations, and was asked to talk about this sort of, I think, in the same kind of vein that Joe here just talked to you about. And the way I decided to try to frame my remarks was to try to cast these relations and maybe offer some thinking about, things that could happen in the future, I guess, in the context of what I think of as, first, the logic of markets. Okay, I'm in a room full of, I'm a war guy in the room full of gas and oil experts and economists, and so I'm a little bit of a fish out of water here. But I'll talk a little bit about the logic of markets and the impact I think that has on state behavior. I'll also talk a little bit about what I call the logic of international politics, which, again, I'll summarize, but I think is kind of different, right? And then last but not least, the wild card of domestic and institutional politics, which I think in the context of both have a profound impact on state behavior and foreign policy, and I think domestic politics in particular, and I would argue, as I'll say at the conclusion, in the United States is a particular sort of wild card, I think, at this stage of the game. But I'll start out talking about the logic of markets. So as I said, I'm a war guy in a room full of economists and oil and gas experts. And I think Amy brings me here to kind of rain on your parade a little bit, okay? Be the doom, I'm the portender of doom. But as economists and market experts, you rely on empirical data. We've had lots of these wonderful presentations here today that sort of show us, that the markets are built on this sort of a sound sort of a mountain of empirical data that demonstrate the essential logic of the way the marketplace works, and that you expect in your profession, of course, that the market works more or less predictably, right? There's a supply, there's consumers, and that the markets deliver mean reversion in pricing. Okay, this is an important thing, right? Without mean reversion in pricing, the market participants can have confidence in the operations of the market. Meaning, of course, that the logic of the markets governs the interaction of market participants, right? It's really all quite rational, right? I mean, that's one of the messages I get from listening to you. And I agree with all of what you say, that there is this inexorable logic of the market. I mean, this is all backed up, of course, by game theory theorists. Market participants share basic assumptions, and they accept the logic of market-based interactions, okay? That's the good news, all right? But I'm here to tell you that the logic of markets does not necessarily follow the logic of international politics, right? To be sure, these logics are connected. State behavior is certainly affected by the logic of markets, but they're also shaped by a variety of other factors: domestic politics, bureaucratic, organizational politics, and perceptions of threats to the state, of course. To be sure, I would say the logic of markets seems to have powerfully affected the calculations of developed states to go to war. This is the good news, all right? War between developed states today has pretty much ceased to be a defining feature of the modern world. The world remains a very violent place. I think there is a generalized, however misplaced, perception that the world has become this deep and darkly more dangerous place. In fact, the opposite is true. The world has actually become a safer place. But suffice it to say, there is this overwhelming calculation in the developed states around the world that war does not pay. Right? That is to say, it has pretty much ceased to be this instrument of dispute resolution or as a tool to promote power and influence among the developed states, not the developing world. The developing world, as I said, you can get out the maps and you can see where the wars of today are happening, okay? Now, what does this have to do with energy? Well, war over energy is deemed to constitute perhaps one of the few remaining causa belli that might cause developed states to reconsider this calculus. The critical feature of energy markets, like all markets, of course, is the ability of the markets to deliver mean reversion in pricing. So long as the mean reversion holds, the participants retain confidence. But if markets can't deliver mean reversion to pricing that delivers steadily increasing pricing, the argument is that the participants begin to consider the use of coercive instruments to secure their interests. Okay? I mean, this is the peak oil kind of scenario. I mean, people in this audience know more about this than I, but there's this sort of scenario of steadily increasing pricing, states reconsidering, as I said, their sort of coercive sort of options to manipulate the markets. So what does this have to do with U.S.-China relations? The question here, it seems to me, is will these relations be governed by the inexorable logic of markets, or alternatively, will they be affected by the unpredictability of international politics, right? It has to be said that war or conflict between these two states is certainly a scenario that would profoundly and systemically disrupt markets around the world. But the logic of the market, of course, suggests that these two hegemonic powers would never fight each other. I mean, why would they? Why would we go to war with China? Both states are the largest stakeholders in the peaceful operation of global markets. Both depend on the markets for prosperity and stability, and both depend on each other. We're interdependent on each other. We're China's best customer. The U.S. way of life, like it or not, is in part built on access to cheap Chinese goods. But the fact is, right, I say it's a fact, but this has been the case in history, of course, that states have gone to war with their best customers in the past, and they may do so again in the future. So the logic of international politics, I've given you this as the preamble to talking about the logic of international politics. First, the logic of international politics, or one of the logics, and I'm here in the Baker Institute, and I would have said that if Mr. Baker were here today, he might actually agree with this. It's that political friction and rivalry are one of the natural laws of these politics. International politics is not all about sweetness and light, right? It's about a state of nature, right, in which a bunch of actors are pursuing their own interests. And this includes, of course, relations between developing states. We don't all agree on everything. Okay, so what are the situations in which we bump up against the Chinese in this process, this process of friction? The first, of course, is the major regional contingency, which in the Pentagon is of course, a defense planning scenario. One of the questioners referenced this. What about the Taiwan Strait, kind of scenario? This has been a central kind of a feature of U.S. defense planning for the last 20 years, which is to say that the United States Navy believes that it has the mission of defending Taiwan from the cross-strait attack. We do exercises on this every year. I ride aircraft carriers out to Hawaii a couple of times a year as part of an education program. And one of the things they do when they get to Hawaii is they run an anti-submarine warfare exercise, and it's all about, trying to prepare for this scenario with the Chinese. Interestingly, of course, as our own anti-submarine warfare sort of capabilities have all but gone away. Now we can sort of poo-poo this scenario, but it is in fact taken seriously in the United States Navy. I am personally skeptical, frankly, and if I was ever asked, not likely, but if I've ever asked, I would advise against any American president seeking to contest such a cross-strait attack. This is a defensive commitment that's a relic from the Cold War, but nonetheless, this is certainly a one area where we can bump up against one another. Second, China is also in the process of adjusting the force structure of the PLA to enable it to protect China's growing global interests, which is in part, of course, driven by its interest in diversifying sources of energy around the world. It's creating a military infrastructure in and around the Indian Ocean, for example, this so-called the string of pearls it's called. It's mainly intended to support China's growing maritime presence along its sea lines of communication. And as was referenced, they've built an aircraft carrier, and this has prompted, sources of concern in Australia and in the Asian states, for example. Now, it has to be said, of course, that the United States adopted this approach a long time ago. We've got military bases all over the world, too, that support our global operations. I think interestingly, though, and this, again, points to another asymmetry in the Chinese-American relationship, I think the United States has pretty much given up on the idea that these bases are intended as sort of instruments to sort of protect specific American sources of supply. This is unlike the Chinese, I think, who are this is very clear. I think for us, we have gotten to this point, the United States, that is to say, where, again, as a nation that is philosophically committed to the idea of free markets, we pretty much view now our overseas basing infrastructure as an instrument to protect the orderly function of global markets writ large. And this is not the case with the Chinese, I would say. Not yet, anyway. It remains to be seen how their thinking evolves on this. But back to the Chinese activity, for example, in the Indian Ocean. It seems to me, we look at this activity with somewhat of a yawn. I mean, so what? They've got some berthing stations somewhere. They're tying their ships up in Oman, I mean, come on. I mean, this is really, as the previous speaker, it's kind of a strategic shoulder shrug, frankly. I mean, I was out on the Roosevelt last year, and I asked the commander of the air group about the Chinese carriers, and he had an interesting response. He laughed about it, and and he said, there might be no more quick way to bankrupt the Chinese than to get them to build, operate, and maintain a bunch of new aircraft carriers. I mean, there is no more expensive and complicated weapon system in the world to operate today. Right? I mean, honestly. But despite all this, while we might look at this somewhat less alarmingly, this view is not shared by our Pacific and Asian friends and allies. Ask President Obama, Secretary Clinton, Secretary Panetta about the messages they're getting from our friends and allies, and this is the opposite. They fear what they see as China's rising power manifested in part by the aggressive PLA and the potential growth of these hard power instruments. So there is this, another point of friction. The previous speaker talked about the relationships with Iran, again, another source of friction. So again, these are potential sources, these are places where we could bump up against the Chinese in a, sort of realpolitik, realist sort of oriented sort of view of how we could interact in the international environment. Now, the last part that I'll talk about is the logic of domestic and organizational politics, also important things that affect state behavior. And as I said, just because of the essential logic that exists today about the undesirability of war between developed states, this doesn't mean this will continue in the future. And I base that on a couple of observations, assertions, I guess you can call them. The first is that political decision makers are human beings, right? And human beings can make stupid decisions, right? They've done so in the past, and they will do so again in the future. And I have to tell you, right, here again, I'm sorry to be saying this in the Baker Institute, but I'd have to say that the United States is frankly a greater source of concern in this matter than the Chinese, who frankly play their cards very close to the vest, right, and have done so very conservatively and very well. I mean, the fact that the international community expressed such outrage, for example, over the standoff in the South China Sea between an Indian and Chinese naval vessel back in August tells you something about, how unserious, I would argue, that the situation really is. I mean, from the perspective of the U.S., as I said here, we've just emerged from what I would call a catastrophically stupid war in Iraq. And do you think as a country that we're collectively looking in the mirror right now, scratching our heads and asking ourselves what went wrong? I mean, I don't think so, right? And in fact, the same bunch that brought us the war in Iraq are circling ominously and calling for yet another war with Iran, okay? I mean, take a look at the Republican candidates for president. The only difference in opinion between these candidates is how hard to hit and when to hit the Iranians, right? I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, do you hear Chinese leaders, talking, in this way, with the sort of mailed fist? So my view is, though, that our own national level of sort of confusion about using force really is just a sort of a mirror of the disintegration of our own domestic political consensus. I mean, the fact of the matter is that American foreign policy has been supported over the sort of the Cold War era, the last 50 to 60 years, by a centrist consensus of Republicans and Democrats. And this institute was named after one of those very prominent members, a classic member of this centrist consensus. This consensus doesn't exist anymore, right? And this induces, I would suggest to you, great uncertainty in American foreign policy. Now, China's not immune from these uncertainties as well. The People's Liberation Army, for example. I mean, I talked to the American Navy about their interactions with the PLA, and they kind of don't have a very good view of these guys. And they tell stories of a very aggressively oriented leadership that is exerting a sort of a pronounced level of influence in Chinese decision-making, political decision-making calculus. And there is real concern in the Pentagon right now about the growing sort of influence of the PLA in the intra sort of organizational decision-making apparatus in China. So this institutional sort of power of the PLA, I think, is something that China watchers really have to sort of pay some close attention to. So my concluding remarks are that the logic of international politics and the logic of markets are not aligned. Okay, surprise, surprise. And this lack of alignment is a source of unpredictability in state behavior that can lead to conflict and can lead to friction. The logic of the market, of course, suggests common assumptions, rational actors, mean reversion in pricing, and predictable behavior. The logic of international politics also has a certain sort of suggests a certain predictable behavior, but it suggests a behavior that could result in conflict and war. The international politics, it says, as I said, this logic suggests the inevitability of friction and rivalry. When you throw in the wild cards of domestic and bureaucratic politics, you can create a sort of an atmosphere of pronounced behavioral uncertainty, which, as I said, does and will affect, I think, U.S.-China interactions over the foreseeable future. My concluding thought is, as I said, that these factors will all interact in unpredictable ways and could, sort of bring us into this sort of era, this era of friction that U.S. gas and oil experts might not like, but which the international politics people would say, well, it's just inevitable. So, I'll conclude.
I heard one scholar from Vietnam. He said that we are welcoming China's peaceful rising, this kind of thing. Then he also said United States should be peaceful declining.
Should be peaceful
declining.
Well, yeah. I mean, look. I mean, I don't expect the United States to surrender its interests. This is going to take some managing in the relationship. And I might point out that both of us have sort of ignored in both of us in our discussion, particularly in the medium to long term, the importance of other countries as well. And China, India is the key one. So this alliance, peaceful. The Cold War was peaceful in terms of major warfare between developed countries.
This is I guess a sort of a question is, I would beg to differ. The Cold War was a very violent period on the periphery, and the Vietnam War was not an unviolent encounter. It seems, and I didn't specifically reference anything about energy, about markets in this talk, because, as I say, it seems to me that it's in American interests for China to get as much access to as much energy as it possibly can. I mean, the United States, and this is following on the logic of the inexorable logic of markets, that we need China to succeed and grow, and that the last thing the United States, it seems to me, wants is to see some sort of systemic disruption to this process. For example, which the MRC, the cross-strait Taiwan, is this, as I said, it's an outdated defense planning assumption, which is unfortunately, I think, still taken seriously in some quarters. But that the logic of American intervention on a cross-strait attack, it doesn't do anything for me, But as I said, the overwhelming calculation, it seems to me, is on this peaceful coexistence, and I hope it holds. I'm not calling for war, believe me.
We'd something better than the Cold War, a peaceful coexistence.
Well, I think if to follow forth this market metaphor, the market sort of metaphor here with China and American symmetry here, the Cold War is governed by a strategic symmetry, right? That comes from mutually assured destruction, nuclear weapons, and we agree essentially. We share important assumptions that essentially guide the interaction of the adversaries, and which this centrist domestic policy sort of a group in the United States, sort of figures out that, well, we're just going to have to negotiate arms control with these people, and we're going to have to figure out how to peacefully coexist, even if we don't really like them. Again, Secretary Baker's part of this strand of thought. The same sort of logic applies to American-Chinese interactions, which is that we have these very strong shared interests, and I would have said that the Chinese I'm not a China expert, but they are de-emphasizing the ideological nature of their regime. They're really, interested in economic growth and having this sort of, steadily raising standard of living. And that these shared assumptions with us, that is to say that the American backyard, much as you might not like it, it's built on Chinese plastic, that these interactions, sort of necessitate this sort of cooperation. This is the argument, again, that says war does not pay, and, statesmen will clearly grasp the strategic logic of this argument. I hope I'm right.
Mr. Russell, you, first of all, thanks for your thoughts. I wish our policymakers today would adhere to similar thoughts such as yours. After World War II, but a little bit earlier than that, I think the U.S. Blue Ocean Navy has had commanding control of the Indian Ocean by far, and the baton was passed by the British to us in a rather peaceful manner. You happen to mention the growth of China's presence in the Indian Ocean and the pearl string theory so far. And would you agree that the tsunami in Indonesia really highlighted to the Chinese elites within the Communist Party the need and certainly the lack of a blue ocean navy for the Chinese Navy itself? And recent cooperations in the Indian Ocean with piracy, and then correct me if I'm wrong, they were in Tripoli trying to take out some of their Chinese citizens as well. These type of slow incursions out and away from China itself, do you see a peaceful passing of the baton, 2.0 between U.S. and China down the line, or do you see something that will be a little bit more conflicted?
No, I'm in this group with you basically that argues that on the high seas in particular, I'm in fact I just finished writing a long book chapter on the Indian Ocean and maritime strategy that I'm working on, or book that we're doing, and the conclusion of the book, or particularly of my chapter, is that it's in the maritime domain around the world where the original sort of vision of the founders of the United Nations has actually been realized, which is that the international community now collectively polices the high seas. The high seas are a place of statistically almost no violence. The Chinese, for example, are out participating in the patrols, the anti-piracy patrols off the coast of Somalia. They are not yet participating in the shared awareness group, which is meeting in Bahrain, which is in this informal collection of maritime powers, which is participating in the Bab al, not the Bab al-Mandab, it's the Bab al-Mandab, the patrols there off the coast of Somalia and Yemen. But it's in the maritime domain where international cooperation, international military cooperation is by far the most advanced. And the Chinese, I think our Navy would tell you it's not playing the constructive role in this that it really would, that it should. And the fact of the matter is that, China is a land power, Asian-based land power. They're never going to have the kind of blue water capabilities that we are alone in the world possess, it seems to me, assuming our budget, can continue to support this. But that they will sort of discover again the logic of this, which is the logic of the system in the maritime domain, which is that again it's a collectively and collaboratively policed strategic environment that enables the global system of interdependence that's with us today.
It's a classic economic collective good.
Right.
But I have a question on that, since you're the expert on it. What about India?
Well, no.
And the whole question of greater Chinese footprint in the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, no. I mean, you just read the Indian maritime strategy. You read the pronouncements from Indian leaders, and there is this concern that the string of pearls is, of course, encircling India. And I mean, this really gets back to this point I made about the logic of international politics, which is that China and India have been rivals. They fought each other in a war. They are on opposite sides of the Pakistan-India sort of equation. The Chinese are thick as thieves with the Pakistanis, giving them all sorts of bad things, for lots of help in the nuclear weapons program, the long-range missile program. The list goes on and on. So this is the Indians. There is the unfolding in the Indian Ocean of this sort of what folks would refer to as this kind of strategic triangle of the Indians, the Americans, and the Chinese. And we know who we're with. It's the Indians. I mean, we've made this strategic decision, and it's a easier partnership for us for all sorts of obvious reasons. But again, I guess yes, there is rivalry. Yes, if the same exists in our own Navy, we've had to sort of ban students. Please don't quote me on this, but we've suggested to our naval students, our naval officers, in the strongest possible terms, that they need to stop writing master's degree theses about the rise in Chinese naval power and the threat this poses to the international system, because it's not supportable. It's not supported. I mean, in other words, there's just practical limits to the things that they can do. And as I said, this is also a replay of some of the arguments that were made about the Soviet Union. There were these great fears of the Blue Water Navy, sallying forth from Russian ports, fanning out around the world, and that didn't really work out for them. And the aircraft carrier that they built is now sitting rusting in some godforsaken port somewhere.
Mostly on a bipolar competition between America and China, and you touched on this earlier about the fact that there could be a multipolar world at some point in the future. How do you see that playing out, and do you agree with the notion that a multipolar world increases the risk of conflict?
Look, we're not going to be moving to a pure multipolar war. I mean, some poles are going to be more equal than others. I do think as time develops, we are going to have something more approaching a multipolar world. And it's probably less stable than a bipolar war, although there may be some more theoretical arguments about that. And what I think you're going to see is both countries looking for allies, right? The United States will be looking for friends. I think one of the obvious ally for the United States is India. I think that there'll be some competition over getting Vietnam to be an ally. It's going to be a much more important country in 25 years than it is today. Indonesia is a very interesting country that we tend to overlook. I think we are, and I think that the outcomes in multipolar systems are probably more indeterminate than in a bipolar system, although I'll defer to Dr. Russell on that.
I guess my answer to this is I don't know if we're in a multi or bi or how many polar worlds it is, except to say that one looks at the World Bank's listing of where the money is, and there's about 15 countries that have most of the wealth in the world. Now, so what does this mean about the sort of relative balance of power around the world and the propensity of that system to be able to manage violence, right? If one looks at the sort of incidence of conflict around the world, it's happening in the places where it has been happening, by and large, over the last sort of 40 or 50 odd years. The nature of that war is overwhelmingly intranational. It's ethnically based. The international system, it seems to me, has done and actually the United Nations, the United Nations gets a bad rap around the world, but it's actually, if you look at the trends in UN peacekeeping operations over the last decade, they are becoming more robust. More nations are contributing forces to this. It's not a perfect system. It's not maybe the system that the founding fathers of the UN thought that they were getting themselves into. But there is this background noise level of violence in the international system. There's no way to say that there isn't. But an interesting feature of that violence is that it has not systemically disrupted global seaborne trade, mostly between developed countries. That is to say, violence in the littoral areas, in the littoral areas, has by and large hasn't disrupted a single container ship, or you do see episodic perturbations in energy pricing when somebody attacks an oil well in Nigeria or someplace, but it lasts a couple of days and then it goes away. So this, it seems to me, is this sort of interesting feature, which is that violence on land in the developing world, in the places where we pretty much have, as I said, you know what's happening, it has not systemically disrupted the inexorable sort of progress or flow of modernity, which, as I said, which is happening in global financial flows, global seaborne flows. These are all continuing there. Read the UNCTAD maritime trade transport reports over the last 3 years. 20-foot equivalent container traffic continues its climb, and it's not disrupted by violence on land, by and large.